So first, many thanks to the Observer Research Foundation America for convening this panel on implications for trade and business. I think it says a lot about the outlook for the next administration, confidence that many of us have. Whoops, excuse me. Thank you. For trade and investment under the new trade administration on the cusp of Prime Minister Modi's first visit under this administration, that we're holding this panel, elevating the issue to the same level, or nearly so, as the strategic defense cooperation between the United States and India. And so, again, thanks for pulling this together, ORF team, and very happy to be here on the stage with my close friends, Anand Shah, Rick Rossow, Amy Hariani. I'm going to do some quick introductions of all three of them, and then we'll just put a couple of questions to you that we've discussed in advance, and have a good discussion about the outlook for trade and investment relations between the United States and India, and then, of course, open it up to the floor for some questions. So let me start here. I've got some bios in front of me, although I probably could have done it without them. I'll start with Anand and the way they're ordered on my page here. Anand Shah is currently a partner at the Asia Group, a leading strategic advisory firm in Washington. Anand founded Demiri, a venture that helps corporations align their core businesses with public good in critical international markets. Anand brings over 20 years of experience working across the private, public, and social sectors in India and around the world. Mention a couple of other things in Anand's bio. Before founding Demiri, Anand was Senior Vice President of India rideshare hailing giant Ola. And while based in India, he founded Savarjal, technology and market-based provider of clean water to rural villages and urban settlements, which he helped establish Ahmedabad University. Anand has many, many more accomplishments, but also has great insight into the U.S.-India corridor, and looking forward to hearing from him. Rick, to my left, senior advisor and holds a chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this role, he helps frame and shape policies to promote greater business and economic engagement between the two countries, with a unique focus on tracking and engaging Indian states. He has been working on U.S.-India relations for over 25 years. Prior to CSIS, he served as director for South Asia at McClarty and Associates. Welcome, Rick. And Amy Hariani is a senior advisor and legal policy counsel at the U.S.-India Business Council, USIBC, a leading advocacy group on behalf of strengthening economic ties between the United States and India. She's an international trade attorney and public policy professional with experience in international trade and investment matters related to Asia, with a particular focus on India. Previously, she has litigated several high-profile international trade matters, including Section 337 at the International Trade Commission, advised on export control laws, and WTO matters. Welcome, Amy. So, as I mentioned, we had a couple of questions I wanted to tee up for the panel. For my own very short opening remarks, I do think this upcoming visit of Prime Minister Modi to see President Trump is an important opportunity. I think it's undoubtedly the case that much more work can be done in the trade and investment corridor. Having worked in the last administration on this partnership very closely at the NSC, I think we made a lot of progress on the strategic partnership writ large. We advanced important technology cooperation. But as I think many have observed, the trade and investment framework between the United States and India had never been particularly well developed, or maybe hadn't reached the potential of a partnership on the level, a strategic partnership on the level of the U.S.-India partnership. At the same time, of course, we face certain challenges, and I know my panelists will want to talk a little bit about those, particularly around trade. Immigration is another issue that has been cited as a potential roadblock. But the sense is that this administration and the Indian administration as well are optimistic about the future of U.S.-India relations, and This partnership has been on an upward trajectory for nearly 25 years now. Still, with the president sounding off about tariffs, I am looking forward to hearing about how we take advantage of those opportunities amid the noise and those particular challenges. But I think broadly speaking, look, more can be done not only to address matters of trade, but also to help level the playing field for U.S. companies that are operating in India. We had a goal in the last administration of growing India as a supply chain hub for critical and emerging technologies, yet foreign direct investment lagged in India over the same period, which tells me there are opportunities to do more, but it's not always entirely clear that the new administration will necessarily prioritize those opportunities as much as they might other more traditional trade matters. So let me go ahead and start there. I'm going to go starting with Rick immediately to my left. Just throw the first question out. What are the areas of opportunity to advance the economic partnership between India and the United States over the next 4 years?
Thanks. First I'd like to start off by reminding, too, that here in town we think government makes and breaks commercial relations between two countries. It is nice around the edges. What both countries do domestically, the reforms India makes, things like that, really are going to play the role. I mean, a lot of the great areas that Anthony was talking about the administration worked on, but the bulk of trade still remains in areas like IT services. IT services, that is the bedrock of U.S.-India commercial relations. There's nothing even close. Not defense, not strategic technology, anything. Most companies that have a presence in India, it's based on something related to IT services. Tariffs, we had a medium-intensity trade war the last time that Trump was in office, removing GSP benefits. India got hit by the steel and aluminum tariffs. They initiated retaliatory duties, and yet trade grew during that period. So, we do sometimes overestimate what the bilateral relations mean. The bulk of trade and investment is really made by a million unconnected actors that Amy represents in U.S.-India Business Council and suppliers to her member companies and things like that. But there are some areas that I do think commercial relations can really be boosted by in the next few years. We did some work for the U.S.-India CEO Forum, for instance, in the last iteration. And when we talk about some of those great sectors where Anthony and team were really trying to get more American companies to consider investing in India, what we're kind of lacking right now still is a lot of the small suppliers, the supply chain investments that have to happen there. When you talk about the large OEMs, they rely on small and medium suppliers to provide. When you look at Modi's production-linked incentive programs, to catalog those sectors and find out which American companies produce the capital equipment that can make those sectors where they announce PLI programs successful, and bring them in trade missions and look at policy interventions that help actually India's budget. Had a number of sectors with capital goods. You saw tariff reductions, similar for intermediate and basic industries that go in. So there is a pathway where Make America Great Again and Make It India can work. If you think about it as the computer, no, they're going to be in competition. But if you do think about the details in supply chains, there are some spaces there. The second, I think both governments can do a little bit better job about bridging that gap between how national security is creating economic and commercial regulations. Both countries, the national security establishments are more active than ever in trying to determine which sectors are going to be prioritized, interventions to make those sectors commercially viable. The national security establishment doesn't have as good, I think, of working experience on sharing those initiatives with the private sector. When companies looking to make investments and they see the Trump administration putting tariffs against China, are those going to stay stable for a long period of time? Or is it going to be something that's brought in and goes away a couple of years later? Knowing the answer to that question and knowing how deep some of these interests are is critical for private companies to be able to make investments. And I think American companies investing in India to know what are the next 10 sectors where they might look to try to localize, implement policy, and keep it a long term. That gives you a little bit more confidence to make investments. So I think, with the leaders meeting and subsequent meetings, bridging that gap between national security and commercial regulation needs to happen a little bit better. And my old bailiwick is subnational. A lot of the commercial opportunities do exist when you get outside of Washington and New Delhi. And I do hope that we find some opportunities, some of the initiatives they're talking about of new consulates and trade missions, things like that. Great tools that I think need to be employed in even greater extent in helping companies in both countries find those opportunities. Thanks.
Rick, before I move on to Amy, so you mentioned the next 10 sectors. maybe just a couple. What do you think those should be?
Well, to me, you see, like, Make in India really got out of the gates with a lot of sectors that India wants to offset the trade balance. Things like semiconductors, high-end tech trade. And personally, I don't think that's the best area for India to focus on. I do think that basic industries, I mean, we've seen countries around the world take steps on textiles, basic chemicals, paper mills. Paper mills. How many paper mill executives show up in the room when they've got these big summits? Not very many. But those are sectors where India, you think about some of the infrastructure challenges that most Indian states face. The barrier from having low quality electric power, unreliability in a lot of states is less for basic industries than it is for semiconductors. You lose electricity when you have semiconductor fab going, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars you could potentially lose. Textile factory, it's a whole lot less. So I do think with the budget that you just saw with some of the more recent PLI programs, India is spending a lot more time and attention looking at basic industries. So I'd start at the basics. I think getting textiles right, getting basic chemicals right, getting paper mills right. These are the sectors where I think India can achieve a lot more success today. But I understand the desire to try to offset a lot of the imports on high-end stuff from China and the drive for semiconductors. But basic industries to me seems like an exciting area that I hope we can do a bit more on. Doesn't thrill, the world leaders necessarily, but that's where jobs get created and trade balances can be improved.
Thanks, Rick. Amy, what do you think are the areas of opportunity to advance the economic partnership between India and the U.S. On the cusp of this visit?
Thanks, Anthony, and great to be here, everyone. See so many wonderful, friendly faces in the room. To kind of springboard off of Rick said, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. No one notices. There's a lot of opportunity for us to, talk about tariffs in some of the sectors that I think everyone agrees is already out there. So energy, defense equipment, I think that'll get us a long way in making some progress on trade. But I think there's some other areas that not as, in kind of what Rick was saying, not as sexy, but still very meaningful. And not just meaningful on the trade balance, meaningful in job creation, which is equally as important. And not just engineering job creation, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but job creating for middle class, good working class jobs in America. So I think of industries like some of the agricultural products, for example. I think pharma, there's a lot of potential for us to collaborate more with India on pharma, particularly bringing API both to our country and to India, and how we manufacture API and work together on some of the advanced pharmaceuticals. So I think those sectors is where I would urge this administration to look at, both from a job creating standpoint, but also a little bit of a tariff rebalancing standpoint. I think the other thing is that there are things that we can do together that are win-win for both and still look good for some sort of trade agreement, which, by the way, I hope when the Prime Minister comes, they will announce that, we are again launching a mini FTA negotiations or whatever it was called around the last time, because I think everyone's ready and eager, and from the Chamber of Commerce perspective, we're really eager for that to get started. But I think of industries, for example, like why can't we increase the H-1B cap substantially for India? I think there's an appetite in this party to do that. I think it's a win-win for a lot of people in this category. So if we're looking to deliver something, we can come back to totalization. That's an important issue, but let's work together to increase H-1Bs, and I think that there would be some substance there for both sides. So we have at USIBC really been trying to think outside the box for what are some new and creative things that we can put on the table, because we're ready and excited to engage in a set of new negotiations with the new administration. Not to criticize the last one too much, but I think we just heard a lot more crickets in terms of trade negotiations. So yes, it's going to get a little messy. I think I've used this analogy, and so forgive me if you've heard it from me like 10 times before, but if you've ever been out to a bazaar and you haggled over that T-shirt you wanted and you offered them 10 rupees and they're insisting on 50, and then you walk away and then they come back and you know what I mean? I think it's going to be fun, and I think we're going to have to haggle a bit, and we're going to have to negotiate back and forth, but at the end of the day, we're going to get the thing we want, and we're both going to be happy. And so I'm excited that we're both coming back to the table, that there's some new good ideas, and look forward to working with some of our member companies to advance those ideas.
Amy, thanks. And I don't think you're wrong about trade and investment in the last administration. I think it was a challenge, and I mentioned, but I don't think it was unique to the last administration. I think going back some time, the two sides, I think, had a little bit more to do with India in the past, did struggle to put together a trade and investment framework that could really help harness and accelerate the economic partnership between the two countries. But you mentioned pharma and APIs. I think it's a good example, and maybe I just wanted, if you could tease it out a little bit more, your views on it. The question of India as a hub for global supply chain resilience and diversification. I think the last administration had articulated a vision for India playing a role in that, at least in some areas. In other areas, they were a little bit more neuralgic, including pharmaceuticals, for example. So how do you think the next administration should look at this question? I mean, it kind of comes down to friendshoring versus reshoring. I mean, where should the priority be? Are we still interested in India playing this role, particularly vis-a-vis China? Or is it just not where this administration's priority is going to be in your assessment?
So I think so, but I think, look, I think what we're advocating for is redundancy in both markets. So API or any other sensitive ingredient should not be produced only in one country, nor should it be produced, let's say, in just a second country. You've got to have multiple locations, because we all saw with COVID what happened when there's a health problem, there's a transportation, whatever the problem may be, right? So I think, frankly, the US needs to be producing more API as well. And to do that, we need to get rid of certain environmental or relax environmental regulations. We got to relax some labor regulations. We got to reduce red tape here too, in addition to doing that in tandem with India. So what we're proposing, and we did put out 10 big ideas for the Trump administration, and I'm happy to share that paper, and I think Emily might have copies back there of it, is that we dual locate a lot of these factories. We collectively work together so that more Indian companies are producing here, and we do that by reducing red tape, softening environmental and labor regulations, and then vice versa in India as well.
Thanks, Amy. So, Anand, what do you think are the opportunities for India-U.S. trade and investment?
Well, I followed two experts, so, I agree with most of what they said. I mean, I'd add a couple of things. One, I'm very optimistic about what the trade agenda looks like. I think that, immigration sort of trade on the optics sense, and I think a lot of it is optics right now, really focused on domestic, the things that we worry about are focused on domestic agendas here in the US. However, I think the last administration did a lot of work on sort of, furthering the strategic agenda. I think a lot of that is going to continue to be important. I think that, India is in a very interesting place. It's different from where it was in 2017. India has an economic mandate that is really significant politically. There are jobs that need to be created in large numbers. There is, it is at the point where it's the economy stupid at some level when it comes to politics domestically in India. And, I have a lot of faith that the government in India understands that, but is also at a point 10 years into their life where a lot of things are harder to do than they were when you were fresh and new. I think that on the US side, you've got a government that is more intentional than I think it was in 2017. It's in a hurry, and it's in a hurry to make things happen. I think India is high on that list of countries to make things happen with. I think the Indians recognize, for example, like Harley Davidson in the previous administration became this massive dark cloud for zero good reasons. But the Indians sort of let it prolong, and it turned into an issue that represented trade in a way that it shouldn't have. And I think that what I've heard on the Delhi side is like, we should have resolved that on day one. It wasn't that big of a deal, and we would have moved forward. And I think they're coming in smarter with that attitude this time, which is like, look, you guys want to get something done, we want to get something done, let's do it now. I think the Trump administration also recognizes from its previous avatar that, a lot of stuff happened in the last year and didn't get a chance to really come to fruition. At some level, a lot happened in the Biden administration also towards the end that didn't get to see its value. And I think that on India specifically, we're going to see a lot of momentum, at least in the early days, starting Thursday, hopefully, that suggests that there's a lot to be done here. So assuming that the Indian side can respond to that, a lot of which my colleagues here have spoken about, but many things that are strategic in terms of de-risking supply chains. The PLI schemes of India have been an attempt to do that, and I tell many folks that we work with that I don't think the PLIs are limited to what programs they've set up, but there is a deep understanding in India that there's an opportunity to build a manufacturing economy in becoming a +1 of sorts. And if there are things that are substantive to the rest of the world that India can be a maker of, I think there's willingness to adapt to that, with a little bit of effort. The challenge that we're facing, you've got a fresh and young and hungry administration on the U.S. side that feels like it has a brand new mandate that's almost worth erasing the previous administration's activity and saying like this is new. And on the India side, you've got a system that is now ingrained in how it operates, and there needs to be a little bit of a fresh push for that. I think in that fresh push, we will see interesting things happen. Right, many of these things mentioned, but I think on defense cooperation, there will be more. There will be a push from the U.S. that's more. There's a lot of ancillary elements to that. I think on things like space, there will be more. But I think there's going to be a lot on the tech side, manufacturing of basic things that, other parts of the world are in turmoil from, and India's got a lot of labor for and capability for that don't need to be top-line headlines of investments in India per se, but they're part of remaking the world in a way that, supposedly it's being remade now. And I think those are really, really big opportunities. So to me, the intent of both sides wanting to do something in a hurry, early in this U.S. administration and at some level early in this Indian administration, at a time where India's got an economic engine that needs to move and the U.S. has things that it wants to say and do, really sets the stage for a lot of opportunity.
Anand, thanks. I'm going to stay with you because my next question was about challenges to a deeper trade and economic relationship between the U.S. and India. And you mentioned one amid all of the considerable opportunities the two sides have before them, which is, we're dealing with a new administration. Some of that is personnel and bureaucratic, and some of it may be that the messaging coming out of the administration can sometimes seem a bit disjointed, and that's not entirely surprising. One issue is tariffs, and I don't wish to overstate tariffs amid all the other opportunities, and it may not be a particular challenge, but nevertheless, I'd welcome your thoughts on it, and then any other observations on particular challenges the two sides may face. But the president has announced an intent on reciprocal tariffs. India has a high tariff rate. I think it's roughly 11%, median tariff rate after the reductions in the last budget, considerably higher than the EU or Japan, for example. In the first Trump administration, I think the two sides managed tariff pressure pretty well and actually made a lot of progress on the strategic side. For example, STA1 happened even as India's eligibility for GSP was rescinded and as steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed. So maybe a little bit on that if you think it really is a challenge, or maybe not. And then other challenges you see, that the kind of things that could, I wouldn't say derail the partnership, but that can slow down the momentum, because I agree with you that the new administration wants to get a lot done fast.
Yeah, I think the big risk is this. I'll come to tariffs in a second, but the big risk is this sort of one-size-fits-all method that is being used in the early days of this administration here, in that, I think, the biggest trouble that I anticipate in getting Indian willingness is that this administration doesn't create domestic problems for Indian polity, right? So we saw that with the plane showing up in India with immigrants. India has already made very clear that it's willing to cooperate on returning immigrants, but when the optics for a domestic audience here turn into a political problem in India, it sort of starts creating or tying your hands at some level. And I think there's a bunch of things like that. That's true on tariffs. It's true on many things, which is a statement of, this is how we're going to deal with the entire world at once. I think the Indians are prepared for that, for what it's worth. And I think Amy notes this, and I agree that I think that there is, of all the countries that India could have a FTA sort of thing with, from their perspective, America is one to do it with, right? As I think the UK was as they were trying to finish one before Rishi Sunak left. And I would expect that they will come to the table ready and eager to see that happen, and which I think will sort of also serve the purpose of what the U.S. administration wants, is look, this is a negotiating position. You open things up for us, we'll open things up for you. We're not going to let you get away with being, a higher tariff area. And I think that the Indians will find some answer to that that's creative. So I'm not terribly concerned on the tariff side, except for one-off elements that are being applied globally, like the seal tariffs announced yesterday, and like what that ends up meaning, how that gets reworked. I think it's been 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Like, we got a lot of time ahead of us, maybe in the next month. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think where the deeper troubles end up being soft ones. It's just political optics elements and what's being said and how you respond to them and vice versa. And I'm fairly optimistic there as well, because I think, there's a lot of good chemistry that was well cultivated between Trump and Modi, and I think was true in the last administration, Democrat-wise as well. And I think that chemistry goes a long way in circumstances like this, where there's an understanding and some trust and element of that. So, where there are other issues like pushback from the speed of Indian bureaucratic decision making, for elements, for example, on strategic issues, on defense, or on levelizing the playing field, like I think the speed at which the promise of this trade relationship or business relationship goes is really dependent on how quickly, at this moment, the Indian side is capable of moving.
Good. Thanks, Anand. So, Amy, you're optimistic. So what do you think, though, are the challenges if you look out ahead to this coming week, and then also in the months ahead in terms of what could be deep challenges, obstacles to deeper U.S.-India cooperation on trade and investment?
Yeah, I agree that right now everyone's in a hurry. I think the U.S. administration feels very emboldened to move quickly. I think, frankly, Modi had a good outcome in Delhi last week. Is that last week now? And so I think there's a lot of sense of political strength on both sides right now. I think the challenge will be on both sides, but perhaps more in India, is getting the bureaucracy to move with that speed. Because there is a newness in this U.S. administration, so I think these people have only been working 3 weeks of 80-hour weeks, so they're not yet burnt out. But in a few months, that might be different. But in India, I still remember when Modi first took office, how quickly bureaucrats were summoned and said, get to your desk, we're going to work long hours, this is a new man in town. And with every new leader brings a new sense within the bureaucracy of paying attention and kind of getting things together. So I think we may have a challenge in moving that bureaucracy. But I still think that there's enough at the top right now on both sides to push through. And so, I am confident, maybe not, I'm optimistic that, hopefully trade negotiations will be launched this week, a mini FTA or whatever we're going to call it. And I hope that by the end of the year we have a deal. We have a mini deal. That's aggressive. That is super optimistic, but I think the people are interested in doing something that quick, and so I think that would be what I would encourage, and not let our bureaucracy get in the way.
Amy, really quick, what do you think the framework should be for trade negotiations between the U.S. and India? Put more simply, who should lead? I mean, USTR, I assume the new USTR will be confirmed soon, and so you think it'll be traditional sort of USTR to commerce negotiations, or is there a different approach? The last administration obviously leaned a bit more on NSC, although it didn't do trade, but on some of the strategic stuff.
I do think it should be USTR, but I do think that there needs to be better alignment between the other agencies that support that. So I'll say Commerce, for example, because what we have seen in the past is you have an agency like USTR lead, and then Commerce may come in with a different, almost counterproductive approach to the negotiations, and not to also pull my State Department colleagues that are out there. But I think if USTR is going to go very hard throttle or very aggressive on some of the trade negotiations, to have another agency come around and say, oh, but what about this or what about that? We need to do a softer approach, I think undermines the whole negotiating tactic. So what I hope happens is that we as a collective government can all be on the same page with the negotiation strategy and where we're going. So I do think USTR leads. I think Commerce will be directly hand in hand with them on some of that stuff. But I think they will have a strong blessing, if you will, from the White House. I don't think necessarily the NSC, because I think this administration has made it quite clear that we can separate the trade from the geopolitical. The geopolitical will still be strong and can run strong. That doesn't mean that we can't hammer our fist down on the table on trade and still have a really good relationship geopolitically.
It's good advice. Rick, what do you see as the big challenges looking ahead?
Three things I was thinking about when you posed the question. Getting back to tariffs, to understand how much of a punch India can take. I am less bullish on what's going to happen in the next 4 years. It's going to be a boxing match, and I think India is willing to take a few hits, but there's a limit. The United States, both political parties are very anti-trade, and our country's trade deficit to GDP is 2 or 3%. India's is 8% up to 12%, depending on the year. So there's a limit to how much we can push India on trade and tariffs. The United States is the major country with which India has a trade surplus, and keeping that as safe and secure as they can has got to also be a political priority in India. So I think there's limits to how much that we can push on this. Now, what I just said in terms of less bullish could be changed by the end of the week, as if Amy's hinting, if we actually do think something big and aspirational. But the last time Trump was in office, it was a 4-year boxing match. Very little good came out of it. And I think that's probably what will happen based on past, but hope I'm wrong. I love being wrong. This is one of those times. Second is, I think one of the first casualties, something that was particularly unique and exciting, I think, in the Biden administration was, this direct encouraging of outbound American investment, friendshoring. I mean, we talk about it in a kind of a general sense, but, for those of us that think that climate change is a thing, India's climate commitments are almost entirely based on job creation. Voters still don't, poll after poll show that climate change, even though they feel the impacts of it, still rates really low, but job creation is extremely high. And we announced we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and just after that, DFC puts almost $1 billion in 2 solar manufacturing facilities in India. We announced the CHIPS Act, and you saw in the joint statement, something you know very well, a number of outbound investments by semiconductor firms to India. And that's got to be a casualty of this administration. I can't imagine encouraging outbound investment in these sectors. In some areas like India's climate commitments were absolutely based on job creation. The United States had a modest role to play in that, and I think that kind of falls off the radar screen. And third, as we were talking about kind of in the green room before we came out, and I mentioned it briefly in the beginning, there still really isn't a place that services trade gets highlighted and prioritized, particularly IT services. You think about a lot of the elements that go into that. On privacy, we've had a difficult time having serious conversations with India on its long driving privacy laws. The trade groups have been great on that, but government to government was a little bit tricky. Cross-border taxation issues that are underpinning. Again, this is the bedrock of U.S.-India commercial and really hasn't been part of the major discussions. And I'd like to see that elevated and highlighted the way that defense and strategic trade has been. I think we have enough space where we can cover a lot of these things simultaneously. The last thing I'll mention, though, is less, again, on the bilateral. We've seen in almost a year now of the Modi government's third term, very little initiative in terms of big reform ideas. And that enthusiasm. One of them, which is pending right now, is a lot of you know I may retire soon if they pass the insurance bill. It was one of the first sectors I worked on back in 1998 of getting that first bill passed to break the monopoly, and it looks like they're going to move to 100%. But, there's still dozens, about 30 sectors where India has foreign equity limitations. And if they want to attract investment, paring those back. And it's a whole range of areas. Sometimes it's FDI caps, and sometimes it's other things kind of behind the scenes. Like if an American company wants to do big box retail in India, it's $100 million minimum investment, only state governments that say yes, only in cities of $1 million or more. I mean, all these regulations you got to go through to put some money in India to create jobs and grow the economy. In a lot of sectors, some big sectors, is still pretty Byzantine. So I think, seeing a better spark in Delhi, too, on getting some of these issues cleared. And the Modi government's been talking actively about, again, trying to get back on the table on challenging states to do better. That was some of the things in the first term I really liked, ranking states' business environment, drafting model regulations for states, and it's kind of fallen off the radar screen, but they're talking actively about getting back and doing that again, which is great because ultimately you're not investing in India. You're investing in Gujarat or Tamil Nadu or Bihar or Odisha, and helping states to do better is going to be a good move too.
Good, thanks, Rick. Well, I agree with you. I mean, dealing with some of those bedrock investment issues, which is why I come back to, I mean, I retain that there is an opportunity for this administration because I think there were shortcomings in the last administration as well, even within the ISET, in which it wasn't really able to deal with some of those issues in the sort of, let's call it, broader digital economy. Part of that was because USTR and other agencies of government really weren't well integrated into that process. So I do think having a stronger role for USTR, but also I would retain actually some connectivity between all sides of government, because I do think when it comes to a deeper trade and investment relationship, the strategic and the commercial in many ways are quite aligned. But ultimately it'll come down to what the new administration prioritizes, and I guess what the Modi administration thinks it can get away with. So we'll see. But yes, probably the best approach is to do something big and to aim big and to deal with problems that way. So to the ORF team, how many minutes do we have for questions? 15. Not bad.
Dang. You run a good panel, sir.
Let's do questions. Why don't you address them? Let's just do one at a time since we've got 15. And then, but if you have a particular panelist that you'd like to address your question to, go ahead and say so. Otherwise, you know, we'll allow each of them to take them on. Satvik, you have your hand up. Why don't you introduce yourself to the questioners as you before you present your question? Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name's Satvik. I used to work with Anthony. You mentioned that IT services was the bedrock of the U.S.-India trade relationship, especially in service trade. But one of the biggest developments in IT in the whole tech sphere in the last few years has been AI. And there's been increasing fears, especially among IT service companies, especially of the substitution of AI, either USAI or elsewhere. And this is something of a concern to Indian IT companies, of whether they're going to see continued demand if AI can substitute a lot of their product. Do you think that that these developments will rather shift the focus of U.S.-India service trade to things that are more substantial, such as the establishment of GCCs and research and R&D, or do you think that IT will continue to play its central role?
Shot, Rick?
Yeah, I think there's room for all to grow, but you have already seen massive change in what Indian IT services looks like. I mean, it was triggered a lot, there was an IT industry before, but, with Y2K, the telecom reforms that happened the year before, and the creation of the IITs dozens of years before that, was this incredible mix, a moment of opportunity when American companies needed to have trained software engineers go through millions of lines of code. But then what was the first big wave? Call centers, body banks. And, the initial tools on machine learning, one of the first things they were able to do was kind of swap that out, right? You call your bank now, you don't get a person. You get 11 different levels of punching codes in or speaking into the thing and all that. And Indian IT has managed to manage that really well, moving up the value chain. Part of the, part of the reason is because you just don't have the pipeline of workers coming in that they need. And so moving those workers up the value chain is something I know a lot of IT service companies have really been kind of pushing on. So, I suspect India will remain in the leading and cutting edge on doing the engineering, the software development, a lot of products and tools. But you have seen some job changes and some job losses in the IT services industry as the old and people that weren't able to take on new lessons and kind of move in. So there'll be some paring back, but India has shown a remarkable adaptability in taking advantage of the new thing. But the big question is, can they move out of helping others and move more actively into creating new stuff the world's never seen? And that's where I think some of the Modi government steps on actually encouraging and helping entrepreneurs and startups, the big programs have been launching there, hopefully will yield some fruit there so they can get out of working for others and starting to do a lot of leading product development, branded product that we all kind of name and recognize.
I wanted to follow on a little bit about that because actually at USIVC, I think we're pretty bullish at the way AI will more tightly connect the trade between US and India. So will it be disruptive? Sure. Will jobs change? Absolutely. So what coders are doing today isn't going to be what they're doing 5 years from now. I'm a lawyer. What lawyers are doing today is not what they're going to be doing 5 years ago. And I think we all in this room actually could say the same thing in terms of what AI is going to do to disrupt our skill set. But with the, I think, phenomenal growth of large language models here in the US, combined with what Rick just said, the startup and entrepreneur community in India, I think the two can actually piggyback really well off of each other, where you see a lot of growth in startups and concepts that we haven't even yet imagined based on some of the LLMs that are here in the US. I know there is some talk about LLMs in India too, but I feel like that is a good symbiotic relationship, and frankly, the LLMs here are already so far ahead. Of course, we learned a week or two ago that other countries are also maybe far ahead, but my point is that I think that's a good symbiotic relationship that actually could accelerate the trade relationship. I'm not worried about it sort of slowing down or disrupting in a bad way. But we also have a tech, I think you're kind of a tech bro, at least you were in your former life.
You can dress like a tech bro.
Yeah, you're dressed like a tech
the,
bro. Yeah.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I do think that there's, an enormous amount of work until the AI promise of AI's sort of efficiency actually becomes a play. There's a lot of work in building AI applications that I think they will adapt to very dramatically and very quickly. I am hopeful, to Rick's point, though, that India will find its way out of this sort of service to the rest of the world, and like there are big opportunities at home sort of conversation that I think can be ginormous. But that's a technical term. But there's an attitude issue there that for whatever reason, building something original it isn't the first cup of tea. People think it's original, but it's relative. So you'd like to see a DeepSeek come out of India too because of constrained resources and see something happen. And there's many, many things in everything we've talked about, retail and gaming and VFX and name it, and media and whatever it might be that are job creating. So my sense is IT services, given that you just have so much talent, will find something to do.
I have a little joke I use sometimes when I'm kind of giving that India 101 for folks is the day that you open up the matrimonial ads in India and you see 3-time failed entrepreneur as one of the selling points rather than some stable career and things like that, that's when you know society is kind of changing the direction that Anand brought up.
Excellent. Good question, Safik. Please.
Hey, my name is Arun Ayagari. I'm the policy analyst at TV9 USA. As an extrapolation to technology, my question is on digital trade. India has draconian, stringent, rigid, and any other synonymous terminology, data localization requirements. My question is, which obviously is pretty discouraging to multinational companies, that includes American companies as well. My question is, can organizations here put pressure on the Indian counterparts, and as a result, Indian government to relax some of the data localization needs? Thank you.
I wake up every morning and talk about it, actually. No, data localization is something USIVC cares very deeply about, and it is something that we do talk often about. I think it is something you'll see front and center in the renewed trade negotiations with the Trump administration. So we'll see if we get an outcome on it, but I think it's something we care very deeply about as a cost, as a compliance burden, as a cost burden for our companies here, and maybe we'll get it as part of the deal.
Anybody want to take that up? I mean, localization is a hard issue. A little bit like DPI, you start to get into issues that are sort of existential and are bigger than simple commerce, of course, in the US and India, at least in my experience. But nevertheless, absolutely vital and important. And so here again, I think you come back to a much bigger framework in order to address some of these issues. But do you have anything, Rick or Anand, about localization?
I think
thoughts?
companies have had some success. I mean, when I was at the U.S.-India Business Council 1 trillion years ago, that was when they were making the first attempt to model the European Union Privacy Directive. And, companies convinced them it would be dangerous. And because of actions of the private sector, the digital bill that was passed, a lot of the more dangerous elements that were in the first version of it were watered down quite a bit. So I do think companies have had, I know it never feels like it when you're in the fight, but had some ability to actually take the rough edges off. But the area, because we all look at the digital bill, There's actually a lot of regulations that are sectoral regulations. The insurance regulator, for instance, has a whole slew of insurance services that you're not allowed to outsource. And banking, of course, with financial stuff, the RBI introduced a few years before. So, you sometimes you stare at the thing that's coming head on, the digital personal data protection bill, but there's also a lot of other elements sectorally that you need to focus on as well that could come in. But the government's been, relatively responsive when companies bring up the business case on how dangerous it would be and taken some of the rough edges off so far. So good on the trade groups for being able to do that.
Hi, my name is Olivia Gilliand. I am an intern with Deutsche Welle, and my question is for the panel as a whole. We've talked a lot about tech today, the tech industry, and how that makes up such a large portion of U.S.-India foreign relations work. Do you have any concerns about the progress of this partnership due to the prevalence of tech giants and this America First ideology under the new Trump administration?
Anand. Anybody want to jump on that?
I can, yeah. I mean, in general, no. We work and represent a lot of them. I think they do a lot of great work both in India and here. And I think we are all working together, both the U.S. and India, to identify areas of concern and guardrails. I'll give you one example. We've launched discussions with the Indians, and this is in the private sector to private sector, so government maybe not as involved, but I would imagine might be involved, on an AI framework and what that would look like between our companies. And I think it's something where, frankly, we could have private agreements between companies in India and the US on what their AI framework would look like. So I think we both have a desire to work together on a lot of the tech stuff, and I think a desire to also harmonize some of our concerns, requirements, et cetera, so forth, to make sure that the technology accelerates, like the AI framework, for example.
I'll add to that. I mean, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all story, though. I mean, I think that, for the FANG companies, India is a really big market, right? And not all of them make investments in India. It's a one-way sort of thing. I think there are a lot of issues that have been growing as Indian tech companies or Indian opposition to tech companies has grown over the course of years that so far have made some progress. But, on issues around crypto, around Play Store, around, data localization, around DPI, there's going to be payments. There's going to be a lot of boxing, as Rick would like to call it, in my view. I don't know that India backs off of that so easily, because a lot of those issues stem from what they see as national security priorities and or protectionism to play catch-up priorities. And so I expect a lot of tension there for what it's worth. On new things like AI cooperation, I think you'll see a lot of really positive movement. So it'll be a mixed bag.
Did you want to add anything, Rick? I just had a very macro point. I mean, the last administration at times had a pretty strained relationship with some of the tech giants as well. But they were an important factor in advancing the technology partnership between U.S. and India, which undoubtedly did advance over the last 4 years. So, certainly competition, content issues are going to be hard, and they may be issues that some of the tech giants have some challenges in India, and they may be addressable now if the right frameworks are created and the right incentives are in place to actually take them on. So we'll see. Right there. I'm pointing to the fellow in the gray sweater, yeah. Oh, Drew, I'm sorry. Last question?
Hi.
Let's make it
Yeah.
how about 2 quick questions?
Okay. My name is Aditya. I'm a rising senior at the Elliott School of International Affairs over at the George Washington University, and I focus on U.S.-India relations and its history. And I guess my question, as someone that's interested in this research, is that as members of civil society, how receptive would you say governments have been to your policy recommendations, insights? And what do you think of it going forward, especially as civil society, particularly towards foreign policy, grows? So I guess my question is, do they listen? Do governments listen to you?
Why don't you pass the mic to your neighbor, and we'll get one more question, and the panel can take them on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ni from the IMF. I'm part of the India mission team. So my question is, what can be done differently this time? So in the past few years, as everybody here knows, that India hasn't really stood out, in this taking advantage of the +1 strategy compared with some of its regional peers. And we have seen pretty large repatriation, disinvestment flows out of India in the recent months. Plus, a lot of the FDI caps has been undone, like in the past fiscal year. So I'm just wondering what can be done differently this time to actually kickstart, the substantial inflow into India and to really develop India's manufacturing sector. Thank you.
Rick, why don't you take a shot?
Yes, the government of India only reads our work and does everything that we put out. Why is the laughter? I don't get. No.
You're going to do a panel on this in December?
Yeah, right. No, I mean, some of the big things that changed. Can you imagine that you're 1% of the voice that brought an idea up? Maybe. I know some of the reports that we've done, the government's created committees to look at it. There was a big report a few years ago that when we had our first India Reform Scorecard, that a senior civil servant in India had been charged with reviewing those and parsing them out to ministries. And when you read that in the Financial Times, it's great. That somebody's paying attention. If those things change, am I going to stand up and claim credit for it? Well, of course, because it's Washington. But, in reality, it's a small percentage. Maybe we had one voice of many on some issues, because I've been at this for almost 30 years now. I know that people in the government, they believe me, they trust me, we can have good conversations. But with my team, the better work that we probably do is our work with state governments. When a state government, which has very little administrative capacity, is thinking about tough issues on energy storage solutions, and there's 11 different technologies, and what do they go with, and we bring U.S. states as peers and counterparts, or we're talking on electric mobility and healthcare, we find when you get to the local level, and there's a lot more constraints on human capacity and research, that's where sometimes you can have a bigger impact. And it's a lot of smaller things, but ultimately helping a state government make a choice on energy storage is a bigger deal for India's climate goals than any Paris summit is. So we're pretty confident and happy with that level of work that we do as well. I'll let others touch on the trickier part. I think I covered mine. I mean, I already offered 11 prescriptions on that, so I'll let you guys.
I agree in terms of listening to us. I haven't met a government official, both in India or the U.S., that's like, I don't care about your opinion, it doesn't matter. People are always very willing to listen, even if they don't agree with everything you're saying or won't implement everything you're saying. I think both governments, and I would say regardless of political party, the door is always open to come listen. So I don't foresee that being a problem. In terms of what would attract more investment, I think continuing the reforms. Rick, I think, said he thought that some of the reforms have slowed, stalled. What was the word you used, maybe?
All the above.
Okay. So I think, look, reforms generate investment, both here and in India. So I think if you receive reforms here, you're going to see more investment here. I think if you see more reforms in India, you're going to see more investment there. So I think I would encourage both governments to take a look at that and to move forward with some reforms. And I think the investment will follow.
Yeah, I think India's due for big bang reform. It's been a little while since something big has been done, and I think that's not deaf on ears there. So I expect them to figure out how to take advantage of the situation because they need to. It's just existential, if not to meet the promise. To the question of whether they listen or not, all policy change requires many, many voices. The days of a single person whispering and listening to you doesn't happen anymore, right? So, there's many voices involved in convincing policymakers of a position. There's many voices that come freely from all over the place. Sometimes these institutions have changed. In India, there's less think tanks, more civil society, more commercial entities. In the U.S. right now, if you're a billionaire, you can make voices happen. There's lots of questions around that, but that's going to take more thought. An idea gets planted, and then you're going to have to verify it against many things to make it palatable to the systems that make policy, right? So in my view, everyone and many of you in this room have, already do play a role in making that happen, but all of those voices matter.
With that, please join me in thanking what was an excellent panel. Thank you to Anthony, Rick, Amy, and Anand. And it's great to see so many friends in this room. Great to see a full house on U.S.-India relations. We haven't had one of these in a while. I just want to do two things to round out our evening. One is I want to thank my colleagues at ORF America for making this possible. It was a lot of people here. You please mingle and meet with them. Thank you. And finally, please join us for the next hour. We have some refreshments in the next room. Please join, mingle. Part of why we do these things is actually to give you all an opportunity to meet each other. So feel free to, if people have to go, that's fine, but feel free to come up and ask questions to our panelists and others. But thank you very much for joining us at ORF America, and please hope to see you again soon. Thank you.